From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later tonight, the spirit world. Here's what's happening. Well, the owners of a Colorado funeral home have been arrested and charged after the decaying remains of, get this, 190 dead people were found at their facility last month. My gosh. Hamas has revealed its plan for a permanent state of war with Israel, urging allies in the Arab world to stand behind Gaza amid fears the conflict would spill into a regional conflict. Let's check in with Howard Bloom, who's been on assignment on this story for us. Howard, this thing is getting worse, isn't it?
It's getting worse, and it's going to get worse if we allow the Muslims to continue bamboozling us. Hamas has successfully convinced activists from New York to Tokyo that Israel is committing genocide. But the real maker of genocide is Hamas. The New York Times published that blockbuster story you just talked about today on Hamas, and that's a few hours ago. In it, the Times quotes Khalil al-Hayya, a member of Hamas top leadership, and Hayya reveals that one of Hamas' real goals is the permanent war you talked about on Israel's borders that would pull in all the Arab states. The Times interprets this to mean that Hamas' goal is to put the Palestinian issue back on the table. But the Times is being conned. Another Hamas official explained to a Lebanese TV station 2 weeks ago that the real goal is the annihilation of Israel. The real goal is genocide. It is to follow Muhammad's orders. Remember, Muhammad said, whoever of the Jews falls into your hands, kill him. And the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the founder of today's Iran, explained that Islam has obliterated many tribes. In other words, Muhammad ordered genocide. Meanwhile, the most common sort of news story in the last week was the outrage on November 4th when Israel bombed an ambulance outside Shifa Hospital. The Hamas publicity machine painted this as a crime against humanity and claimed that dozens of civilians have been killed, including 5 children. Hamas used the incident to drive home its key propaganda point, that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians. But today, 2 things happened. Israel's Army radio revealed that Hamas headquarters, its top command and control center, is underneath Shifa Hospital, the hospital where Israel had bombed an ambulance, and that the IDF is closing in on this nerve center. Also today, Israel's Shin Bet, its FBI, released videotape of a Hamas prisoner being interrogated. The Hamas fighter was one of the terrorists who tortured, raped, and killed 1,400 people in southern Israel on October 7th. He was a member of the Nukba force. Here's what he said. Hamas has its own ambulances. The appearance of Hamas ambulances is similar to civilian ambulances so that you do not rouse suspicion or be bombed by Israel. In other words, Hamas is hiding behind the skirts of humanitarianism. But that's not all. The Hamas terrorist goes on to say most of Hamas senior political and military figures are hiding in hospitals, especially in Shifa Hospital. Remember, Shifa Hospital hides the tunnels of Hamas central headquarters. The captured Hamas fighter goes on to say, during combat, ambulances are also used to evacuate fighters and operatives. They also transport food, improvised explosive devices, and weapons because that's the safest way to get there. I can leave with any ambulance, he brags, I want. In other words, ambulances are Uber and Lyft for Hamas, which means they are sometimes necessary military targets for the Israelis. Meanwhile, the captured soldier added that a lot of the Gaza Strip had been booby-trapped with cables leading to the operating systems. And where are these military operating systems? The captured fighter says, in mosques and civilian clinics. 10,000 civilian lives have allegedly been lost because Hamas has built its headquarters in 311 miles of tunnels underneath hospitals, schools, and mosques. But in the eyes of Hamas, those 10,000 lives are not losses. They are gains. As today's New York Times story puts it, in the bloody arithmetic of Hamas leaders, the carnage is not the regrettable outcome of a big miscalculation. Quite the opposite. They say it is the necessary cost of a great accomplishment. Or as 2 militant Islamic slogans put it, Islam is a tree that grows on severed limbs, and we love death more than you love life.
We got to get this thing resolved, Howard. Thank you so much. A 5.3 magnitude earthquake hit western Texas on Wednesday morning. The quake struck about 23 miles southwest of Mentone, Texas, about 4:27 a.m. local time. No injuries reported. That's good. Americans are increasingly turning to their credit cards to cover everyday expenses, with debt hitting a new record high at the end of September. In the 3-month period from July to September, total credit card debt surged to over $1 trillion, an increase of $48 billion. Investment analyst Mish Sedlock with us. Mish, what's going on with these credit cards?
Consumer credit topped $17 trillion total. So you were discussing the increase, I believe. The credit card delinquencies rose in the third quarter from 3.69% to 5.78%, over a 2 percentage point jump in credit card delinquencies. We're talking 90 days delinquent or more, so this is not just delinquent, but seriously delinquent and probably heading for default. Well, one of the things happening behind that is we've had record high interest rates on credit cards now, over 22% on average. If you're carrying a balance, that's got to eat in. The New York Fed issued this statement: the continued rise in credit card delinquency rates is broad-based, but particularly pronounced among millennials and those with auto loans or student loans. I look at this and just wonder where it's heading. The New York Times had an interesting political poll that relates to this, and when it first came out, I was really? Voters under 30 favor Biden by only a single percentage point. That was actually quite shocking to me. But if you look, who is it that are the renters? Who is it that has the credit card debt? Who is it that doesn't own a house and wants to buy one? I think that's behind these percentages, George. 36% of the nation rents homes. Now, that means the other 64% own their homes. And I've seen this sentiment on my blog. George, it goes like this. Well, I rent my own home. I own my home. I refinanced at 3%, so I don't care. Well, the 36% who rent, do care. And the extreme polarization, and we just heard it from Howard, and we're seeing it here in the economy as well, between the haves and the have-nots. I'm tired of all the extremism here, George, but I agree with Howard. It's just going to get worse. I don't see who's going to put an end to it. It's very troubling.
It is indeed. Mish, thank you so much. We'll talk to you next week. A tiny alien skeleton discovered in the desert 20 years ago might actually be a small humanoid from the Middle Ages, they say. The skeletal remains, known as Ata, were found in an abandoned church in the desert in Chile in 2003. The individual who found it sold it to a Spanish businessman. Incredible. Up next, Joshua P. Warren joins us. He is, of course, the host of the podcast on the Paranormal Podcast Network, Strange Things. We'll be talking about strange things with Joshua in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast, George Norrie with you. Not a paranormal activity for you. Joshua P. Warren back with us. He is hosting the podcast Strange Things on the Paranormal Podcast Network, which Tom will tell you about in just a few minutes, and how you can listen to him along with Sandra Champlain and so many other incredible stories that are happening. Joshua was one of those people who brought us the story of Robert the Haunted Doll. That's the doll that we'll talk about it for a second. That is still in Florida in a glass jar, kind of looking at people who walk by them. Josh, welcome back.
Well, thank you, George. Always good to be with you.
What's the latest on Robert the Haunted Doll?
It's so funny that you ask me this, because I actually have quite a bit of interesting doll news for you and the listeners tonight.
All right.
When it comes to Robert, he is still there at the East Fort Martello Museum in Key West, Florida, and they keep him in a glass case. and he sits in a little rocking chair there along with his stuffed lion that he always had. Apparently, Robert the doll was based on a real little boy, also named Robert, and that little boy always kept a stuffed doll. So Robert the doll is kind of like a big voodoo doll of the real little boy, Robert. And it's believed, that one of the servants at this wealthy family where the boy lived had some falling out with the family and kind of created Robert the doll in order to cause problems. And it's really odd how the little boy became obsessed with this doll that looks just like him and remained obsessed with him throughout his entire life. And, this story, back when I first began investigating it, we're talking probably, 15 or so years ago, this story was extremely creepy because, when I went down to Key West to visit Robert the doll, the first thing that struck me was that he has this room all to himself, and the walls are just plastered with all of these letters from people from all over the world who have visited Robert, and then they've had bad things happen when they got back home, and they wrote these letters begging him to drop his curse, begging him for some type of relief. They're apologizing because they say that if you go there and you take his picture and you do not ask for his permission, then something bad will happen and you have to get him to forgive you. So it's really unsettling to see all those letters all over the place. But, once I started coming on Coast to Coast AM and talking to this vast audience about being respectful toward Robert, and you've certainly done a good job of spreading that message in all of your travels, the tide started changing. And I don't hear so many stories anymore about people having bad luck around Robert the doll. And I think that's because the word is out. As long as you go there and you treat him respectfully, then he will not curse you. And so he appears to be living quite peacefully. And, because I did this work investigating Robert the doll, people have been contacting me for years to tell me about other haunted dolls. And it just so happens that a brand new one entered my life last month. Do you know about this, George?
I kind of know that you have it because the thing was sitting in our office for a couple of years.
Yeah. Well, here's the funny thing about this particular story. Years ago, Tom Danheiser, he told me that a listener had sent this doll to your studio, and that it was basically an elaborate ventriloquist doll. They technically call them a ventriloquial figure.
It looks like Charlie McCarthy, doesn't he?
It's similar, but this doll is absolutely unique. And you see, the funny thing is, Tom told me that it came with a letter, and the letter said somebody needs to take care of this doll, implying that it has some kind of a spirit, some kind of life. For a while, Tom had misplaced that letter, so the details were fuzzy on the exact origin and the exact story. But Tom told me that he'd been talking to you and that you two felt that this doll should be sent to me. And I said, okay, I'm very careful about the things that I take into my home to study, but given the connection to you and Tom and Coast to Coast, I figured, well, this will be fascinating. But then I waited and waited and waited, and Tom would say, oh, I'm going to send it next week. And oh, no, I'm going to send it next week. And this went on to the point where I started thinking, uh-oh, I've seen this pattern before. People start to become obsessed with these dolls and vice versa. And I started thinking that maybe this doll had attached itself to you or Tom, and it wasn't going to go anywhere. Now, Tom said you didn't really care for this doll from the start. Is that right, George?
I didn't like the way it looked. It had a weird smile on it, and its eyes kind of followed you around wherever you walked.
That's a bad sign, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not good.
And so I wasn't sure if I was ever going to see this doll. And then Tom apparently took this doll to his house. And I'm sure Tom will be happy to jump in if you'd like for him to tell this story. But he started hearing all of these weird noises. If not him, other people in his house would hear weird noises. For example, he had it on one level of the house, and If someone heard what sounded like a bowling ball being rolled around. Tom actually had a little ceramic dish that came flying off of a wall at one point. His security camera captured some kind of a dark, misty form moving up and down his staircase. I mean, all these things started happening, which were not typical for Tom's house. And so finally, Tom and his lady friend said, look, it's time for this thing to go to Joshua. And so last month, sure enough, this grand box arrived, and when I opened it and I took out this doll, named Kennedy, by the way, and as far as I know, there's no explanation for that unless Tom's got some new news. When I took this doll out, I was immediately struck by the craftsmanship used to create this doll. I believe this is a true one-of-a-kind ventriloquial figure. It has... it's the typical size of a ventriloquist doll, and it has these kind of leering, mischievous eyes, and it's got a big red, kind of an eerie grin on its face, coal black hair. He's wearing a little vest and with a tie and some nice trousers. We actually, my wife Lauren and I, we bought him some new shoes. His shoes look like... You
bought him shoes?
Yes. And as soon as I took him out, and of course the head can detach from the body, there were all of these levers. And if you pulled one lever, his eyebrows would go up and down. You pull another one, his eyelids would go up and down. Another one, his eyes would shift left to right. Another one for his mouth. I mean, this was a truly professional build.
Well, listen to this story, Josh. Listen to this quick story. Tom was having some, lawnmower people cleaning his lawn in front of his house while he had the doll upstairs. And the people cut the grass and the clippings were, laying around and stuff. And they did their thing and they left. Well, when he brought Kennedy back to the studio to apparently ship out to you, there were grass clippings on the shoes of Kennedy. How can that be?
Did you say glass?
Grass.
Oh, grass clippings. Oh,
grass clippings. After these people had cut his grass, it had grass clippings on his shoes, as if he were outside running around.
Now, I didn't know that. This is getting better and better.
And you sure you're going to keep him, huh?
Oh, yeah. Well, he's under surveillance right now, and I'll tell you some of the things that have happened since I got him. By the way, if anybody wants to see a picture of him, I've got one posted right now. If you go to joshuapwarren.com, there's a link there at the top to my curiosity shop where I have all kinds of goodies. And if you scroll down that page, you will see a picture of Kennedy the doll.
I love it. We're going to take calls next hour with Joshua P. Warren about the paranormal. So get ready to make a call. He is one of the world's experts in it. And, gosh, I remember that day that we talked about Robert the Haunted Doll on that stage show. Remember that day?
Oh, yeah. And there are some people who are still creeped out enough to get up and maybe take a little break and leave the room for a while. They don't want to hear about Robert. He has a very odd impact on people.
The movie Child's Play based on Chucky, isn't it?
Well, actually, that was a rumor for a long time, but I believe that the actual screenwriter claimed that he did not base it on Robert the Doll. But, that's the thing. He might have just been saying that because he didn't want to conflict with anybody's copyrights or anything. But
yeah, that's
kind of up in the air.
Yeah. That's kind of like that Chucky doll was a mean doll, wasn't he?
Well, yeah, and, before I started investigating these stories about dolls, I thought the idea that a doll could come to life and get up and run around was the silliest thing I'd ever heard. I didn't believe it. And then once I started interviewing people, though, and I'm talking about real professionals, lawyers and chiefs of police and doctors and people who don't want a reputation for sounding crazy, telling me that they had seen dolls come to life and run around. That's when I started to open my mind. And I realized, George, that you know what? We can't explain the mind-body relationship. And so if we don't even know how consciousness animates our physical bodies, why should we stop short of believing that consciousness in life might be able to animate other objects, especially dolls that have kind of a humanoid appearance?
Good point. We're going to come back in a moment with Joshua P. Warren. Don't touch your dial. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Joshua P. Warren with us. His website is his name, Joshua P. Warren, linked up at coasttocoastam.com. We'll take calls next hour with Joshua. Josh, are you seeing more or less paranormal activity these days?
Oh, definitely more. And it's actually not a big surprise to me, because if you look back historically, it seems like that the entire world goes through these big epic cycles.
Yeah.
And these are times when you could say that our dimension comes a little bit closer to other dimensions. And I think if you look back, for example, during biblical times, I mean, the whole world seemed to be just exploding with paranormal activity. I mean, people were sitting down having dinner with angels, and then it seemed like over time it was kind of barren, and there wasn't a lot of that type of interaction. And so we now are heading back. I think it began in 2012, but we are heading back in this direction where there is more and more interaction with the spiritual side, with the paranormal side. And, of course, you know, I live here in Las Vegas, Nevada, and that's part of what they call the Nevada Triangle, which is even more active than the Bermuda Triangle. And I am just seeing the trifecta here. I mean, ghosts, UFOs, monsters, all of that stuff is extremely heightened out here in this desert. And that's why it's a great place for me to have a laboratory and to study things. And, in fact, you know, when I got Kennedy here at my house, the doll we were talking about, by the way, this is kind of funny. As soon as I got him, I took a picture of him and I sent it to my mother. And my mother texted me and she says, "That thing is creepy. I would get rid of that demonic-looking thing."
Mom's right. Mom's right.
But you know what? Lauren and I, my wife Lauren and I, we actually we got a good feeling off of him. Now, maybe that's just because I've got my wires crossed. But I am very careful about bringing bad things, you know, into my house, especially since paranormal activity is increasing. It's on the rise. And so what I did was I put him in a room. I isolated him next to a meter that could pick up electromagnetic and electrostatic fields associated with life. And I put a motion-sensitive camera on him. And I just let it sit there for days. In the meantime, I got a call. Let's see. Actually, I was recording the podcast that Tom just mentioned, and so this is the weirdest thing. You know, I've been doing this particular podcast for over 3 years, but I've been involved with broadcasting for about 20 years, and so there's no telling how many phone calls I've recorded for interviews and stuff like that. And yet here I decided to bring Tom onto my podcast and talk to him about Kennedy. Now, you have Tom, he's been around broadcasting gosh knows how long. I have plenty of experience. We could not get this call to work. We started having every technical problem you could have. And there was we wanted to talk exclusively about Kennedy, and finally I had to resort, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but I had to resort to just calling him on my cell phone, putting it on speakerphone, and recording the conversation with a handheld audio recorder between my face and the phone, because we couldn't get any of the normal systems to work. So that was the first sign that something funky was going on.
Weird.
So then later, here's what happened. After that, probably about 4 or 5 days afterward, I was lying in bed one night. Don't you love it when stories start this way?
Listening to Coast, no doubt.
I'm sure I'd probably just finished. I'm a bit of a night owl, so I usually listen to the end. And I just dozed off to sleep, and something yanked the covers next to my feet.
Whoa.
And when that happened, now you talk about jumping out of your skin.
And not much makes you jump.
Yeah, well, that's true. But I don't like being messed with when I think I'm in the security of my cozy bed at night. And so, I bolted up. And, of course, my first thought was, is there an intruder or something like that, even though I have...
That's right.
security system money can buy. And
which is simply safe, by the way.
Okay, and so I sat there and I was like, you know what? I know it sounds crazy, but it's possible that Kennedy is actually showing his stuff, and he's come in here and he's yanked on these covers. But I knew I had a camera on him. So I got up and I took a flashlight and I walked over to the room where I was keeping him, opened the door. He was sitting there, so I didn't see any evidence that he had moved. With that smile, right? Oh, yeah, and I hope everybody will go and look at the picture because his smile, talk about a mischievous look. You know, a lot of these ventriloquist dolls, they're used in performances where they're kind of little smarty pants, so I'm imagining that that's sort of the demeanor that he had in his performances. But he's got a snide look on his face, and he looks like he might be up to no good. So the next day, when I got up, I went and I pulled the SD card from my camera. And I went back, and sure enough, there was a trigger at that moment because I have a timestamp. And I was like, oh, boy.
Here we go.
And I was like, if I play this clip and this doll jumps up and runs off of this chair, this is going to change my life and probably a lot of other people's lives. Because at least, if thank goodness I'll have the video footage. But, people will say I faked it. You can imagine. They'd say this is crazy. So I sit down and I play the footage. And here is what I captured on video. And I have not released this yet because I decided I'm going to wait and release all my footage at once. You see Kennedy sitting there next to the meter. The meter starts squealing, which means there's some type of a strange electromagnetic force or electrostatic field. And then we have, right at the time when I had that yanking feeling on the sheets, there are these two translucent balls of light that just shoot right past him and over toward the door. And what's funny is that I have no other clip that shows anything like that. And this was triggered by something. It takes some kind of a physical presence to even trigger the motion-sensitive camera. And so I did not see Kennedy physically move, but something was happening around him at the same time that this happened in my bedroom. And so it reminds me of how Tom has video footage of this kind of dark form moving up the stairs of his house. And so I'm thinking that whether or not Kennedy is capable of literally getting up and physically moving around, and it may be because, as you said, if he had grass clippings on his feet, well, how did those get there?
Exactly.
But regardless, it seems like he's got some kind of a spiritual presence around him that is able to travel and able to move around the domain. Now, since I've had him, I have not had anything particularly terrible or scary or anything like that happen. That was the scariest thing for me, was when that happened in my bedroom. But as we speak, he's being monitored, and I don't know of any type of extensive monitoring with any other doll like I'm doing with Kennedy. So after a few months of this, or a year or whatever, I may have this amazing database that we can apply to this entire haunted doll phenomenon.
It could be. Lex has just tweeted a picture of Kennedy as well in Tom's office. And, of course, you've got yours on your website, joshuapwarren.com. It's truly remarkable. What is it about dolls that are so creepy?
This may or may not be related, but it comes to mind. I was recently flipping through the channels at my house and came across the 1994 movie Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was directed by Kenneth Branagh. He starred in it. And I mentioned to Lauren that, she hadn't seen that movie. And I said, this is supposedly, obviously based more on the novel that Mary Shelley wrote when she was 18 years old. Amazing accomplishment. And I was telling her how different that the novel is from, like, the Universal Studios version of Frankenstein with Boris Karloff in the 30s and such.
The old black and white movies. Those are classics.
Love that stuff. Yeah, I'm really into the Universal monsters. And in the book Frankenstein, however, there is much more. There's much more complexity and attention paid to this concept of what life is in general, and whether or not we can create it sort of from scratch. And it's interesting. We think of Frankenstein as being this big giant figure with a blockhead and the bolts in the neck, but he wasn't described that way in the novel. He looked more human-like, but also kind of very sloppily put together, because he was cobbled together from bits of murderers and thieves and whatever Dr. Frankenstein could get his hands on.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, he was big. Frankenstein was made to be large because Dr. Frankenstein said that he couldn't work on these little tiny little details, these little veins and arteries. It was too difficult. So he needed a large thing so he could get his hands in there. So the point is, she doesn't say exactly how that he uses technology to bring the spark of life into Frankenstein. But as soon as he does it, he regrets it. And then, of course, Frankenstein in the novel, he can actually talk. He's quite articulate. A very different presentation, and he's miserable because he doesn't know why he was created. So I started thinking about this idea of what it is that brings a form to life in general, because humans cannot create life from scratch. When we reproduce, we're basically just continuing the life that we have. We can clone it in various ways naturally or in a laboratory, but we can't just make life appear from scratch. And yet, it seems like that there may be this other sort of birthing process by which some people can focus their thoughts so intensely on visualizing something coming to life that they externalize it and actually create some kind of an entity. We talk a lot about tulpas being like this. Tulpas are these thought forms, golems. These are, for example, let's say you might go to a house that looks haunted, but there's no ghosts there. But if everybody talks about how haunted it is for years and years, then suddenly ghosts start to appear there. Because it seems like people have this ability to create living, conscious entities by focus and persistence. And so it seems to me that if you have something like a doll, which mimics the shape and the form of a person, and you are used to associating that form with a living thing, and you have a strong mind and a strong imagination, and you continually project the sense of life onto that thing, I believe its very shape is almost like an antenna for these kinds of thoughts, and that you are able to, in some cases, especially if you have a real purpose, like you're trying to put a curse on somebody or do some kind of a magical ritual, you may be able to focus a part of your mind and your spirit onto this thing and literally surrender a piece of yourself to it. And this is how these dolls begin to actually become living extensions of the Creator.
Do you think Kennedy was sent to Tom and me with ill feelings, or as a truly fun gift?
My feeling is that it was not sent to you with a negative purpose in mind, that instead the doll was sent to you because that the person who owned it just wasn't comfortable having something living that is supposed to be inanimate and didn't know who would have an idea of how to deal with it. But having said that, Tom just informed me before I came on the show that he just discovered rediscovered that letter that came with Kennedy that was lost. And I don't know if Tom wants to read it but on the air, but I haven't even heard it yet. Is that possible that we could all learn together?
It's from another country. It's very complicated, Josh.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess in that case, I'll study it and figure out how to describe it on one of my upcoming podcasts. But having read the letter, I mean, do you feel that somebody was sending it to you for a bad purpose?
I think somebody wanted to get rid of it from themselves first and didn't know where to go and send it, so they sent it to us.
Yeah. Well, but, the thing is, again, it's so striking to me is that he is just so well made. And, I got on the Internet and I searched for all kinds of different dummies that look like this. And hopefully somebody listening to this show will see a picture and may have some knowledge. Maybe somebody out there has seen this doll before. Obviously, he's been performing somewhere out there. But I do know a guy who is a professional puppeteer, and I'm trying to get in touch with him to get his opinion. But, I would say probably since you guys had him for all those years and nothing particularly bad happened, I think he's not necessarily a negative or an evil thing, but I believe he probably, like most of these dolls, likes to be respected. And so I have him sitting in we bought a nice little chair just for him. He's in a chair. He's got new shoes on. He's been groomed. He has a place of respect. And I think if you're going to have one of these dolls, that's one of the best things you can do.
Josh, there was a marionette factory here in St. Louis that burned down. That was a strange story. But we'll talk about more. And the phone lines are open. Share your stories. Maybe you have a haunted doll.